but she did not believe her own words. She did not believe for one moment that the calm blonde woman was mad. Carl, thought Tuppence. Would Carl know? Had he had anything to do with this? However, a few minutes later, she started to doubt this assumption. Carl von Dynam, like the rest, seemed completely surprised. As soon as the facts were told, Major Bletchley took control.
"Now then, dear lady,"
he said to Mrs. Sproat,
"sit down here and just drink a little of this brandy. I'll contact the police station immediately."
Mrs. Sproat murmured, "Wait a minute, there might be something." She hurried up the stairs and along the passage to her room. A minute or two later, they heard her footsteps running along the upstairs hall. She rushed down the stairs and took Major Bletchley's hand from the telephone receiver, which he was just about to lift. "No, no, you mustn't! You mustn't!" And crying wildly, she collapsed into a chair. They crowded round her. In a minute or two, she recovered herself. Sitting up, with Mrs. Cayley's arm round her, she held something out for them to see. "I found this on the floor of my room. It had been wrapped round a stone and thrown through the window. Look what it says." Tommy took it from her and unfolded it. It was a note, written in big, bold letters. "We have got your child. She is safe. You will be told what to do soon. If you go to the police, your child will be killed. Say nothing." Mrs. Sproat was repeating faintly, "Betty, Betty." Everyone was talking at once.
"The dirty, murdering criminals!"
exclaimed Mrs. O'Rourke.
"Brutes!"
shouted Sheila Perenna.
"I don't believe a word of it. It's a silly practical joke,"
declared Mr. Cayley.
"Oh, the dear little girl,"
murmured Miss Minton.
"I do not understand. It is shocking,"
added Carl von Dynam. And above everyone else, the loud voice of Major Bletchley.
"We must inform the police at once. They'll soon find out what's going on."
Once more he moved towards the telephone. This time a scream from Mrs. Sproat stopped him. He shouted,
"But my dear madam, we must. This note is only to stop you doing anything so that they can get away."
"They'll kill her."
"Nonsense. They wouldn't dare."
"I won't allow it. I tell you, I'm her mother. It's for me to say."
I know. That's what they're counting on. You're feeling like that. It's very natural. But you must believe me. I'm a soldier and an experienced man of the world. The police are what we need."
"No!" Bletchley's eyes went round, searching for agreement.
"Meadows, you agree with me?"
Slowly Tommy nodded.
"Cayley?"
Mr. Cayley nodded too.
"Look, Mrs. Sproat, both Meadows and Cayley agree."
Mrs. Sproat said with sudden energy, "Men, all of you, ask the women." Tommy looked at Tuppence, who said, her voice low and shaken, I agree with Mrs. Sproat." She was thinking of her own children. "Deborah, Derek, if it were them, I'd feel like her. Tommy and the others are right. I've no doubt, but I couldn't do it. I couldn't risk it," she said to herself. Mrs. O'Rourke was declaring,
"No mother alive could risk it, and that's a fact."
Miss Minton said weakly,
"Such awful things happen. We'd never forgive ourselves if anything happened to dear little Betty."
"You haven't said anything, Mr. von Dynam," noted Tuppence sharply. Carl's blue eyes were very bright. His face had no expression. He said slowly, "I am a foreigner. I do not know your English police. How good they are! How quick!" Someone had come into the hall. It was Mrs. Perenna. Her cheeks were red. Evidently, she had been hurrying up the hill. "What's all this?" she asked. Her voice was commanding, not the pleasant guest-house owner, but a woman of force. They told her, a confused story told by too many people, but she understood it quickly. She held the note for a minute, then she handed it back. Her words were sharp and authoritative. "The police? They'll be no good. You can't risk their making mistakes. Go after the child yourselves." Bletchley said. "Very well." Tommy added, "They can't be far away. When did it happen?" "Half an hour, the maid said," Tuppence answered. "Haydock," said Bletchley. "Haydock's the man to help us. He's got a car. The woman's unusual looking, you say? And a foreigner? She ought to leave a trail that we can follow. Come on, there's no time to lose. You'll come along, Meadows?" Mrs. Sproat got up. "I'm coming too." "No, my dear lady, leave it to us." "I'm coming too." "Oh, well." He gave in. Commander Haydock, who understood the situation immediately, drove the car. Tommy sat beside him, and behind were Bletchley, Mrs. Sproat, and Tuppence. Not only did Mrs. Sproat cling to her, but Tuppence was the only one, with the exception of Carl von Dynam, who knew the mysterious kidnapper by sight. The commander was a good organizer and a quick worker. In minutes he had filled up the car with petrol, handed Bletchley a map of the district and a larger map of Leahampton itself, and was ready to start off. Mrs. Sproat had run upstairs again before they left, presumably to get a coat. But when she got into the car and they had started down the hill, she showed Tuppence something in her handbag. It was a small pistol. She explained quietly, "I got it from Major Bletchley's room. I remember he said he had one." Tuppence looked a little uncertain. "You don't think that—" Mrs. Sproat said, her mouth a thin line, "It may be useful." Tuppence sat wondering about the strength of a mother's love for a child, even in an ordinary young woman. She could see Mrs. Sproat, the type of woman who would normally be frightened to death of guns, calmly shooting any person who had harmed her child. They drove first, on the commander's suggestion, to the railway station. A train had left Leahampton about 20 minutes earlier, and it was possible that the woman and Betty and whoever else was involved had travelled on it. At the station they separated. The commander questioned the ticket collector, Tommy asked the ticket office staff, and Bletchley checked with the porters outside. Tuppence and Mrs. Sproat went into the ladies' bathroom, just in case the woman had gone in there to change her appearance before taking the train. None of them discovered anything. "The kidnappers probably had a car waiting," Haydock suggested, "and they made their escape in that." Tuppence remarked, "We must put ourselves in their places. Where would they have waited in the car? Somewhere as near as Sans-Souci as possible, but where a car wouldn't be noticed. Now let's think. The woman and Betty walk down the hill together. At the bottom is the esplanade. The car might have been waiting there." It was at that moment that a small man stepped up to them and said, "Excuse me, I couldn't help overhearing what you were asking the porter just now." He directed his remarks to Major Bletchley. "I was not listening, of course, just came down to see about a parcel, and so, you see, I happened to overhear, and really it did seem the most wonderful coincidence." Mrs. Sproat sprang forward. She took him by the arm. "You've seen her? You've seen my little girl?" "Oh, really? Your little girl, you say? Now—" Mrs. Sproat cried, "Tell me!" Tuppence interrupted calmly. "Please tell us anything you have seen as quickly as you can. We will be most grateful if you would." "Oh, well, really, of course, it may be nothing at all, but the description fitted so well." Tuppence felt the woman beside her trembling, but she herself tried to stay calm. She knew the type of man with whom they were dealing, not capable of giving a direct answer, especially if hurried. "Please tell us," she repeated. Tuppence frowned at Major Bletchley, who was about to start shouting at him, and asked, "And you saw the little girl we are looking for?" "Yes, I really think it must be." A little girl with a foreign-looking woman, you said? It was really the woman I noticed, because, of course, we are all on the lookout nowadays for fifth columnists, aren't we? So, as I say, I noticed this woman. A nurse, I thought, or a maid. And this woman was most unusual looking, and walking up the road to the hills beside the sea. She was with a little girl, and the little girl seemed tired, and it was 7:30, and, well, most children go to bed then. I looked at the woman very closely, and she hurried up the road, pulling the child after her. Finally, she picked her up and went on up the path out onto the cliff, which I thought strange. There are no houses there at all. Nothing. Not until you get to Whitehaven, about 5 miles away. Commander Haydock was back in the car and had started the engine. The others jumped in. Tuppence called out, "Thank you!" and they drove off, leaving him staring after them with his mouth open. They drove quickly through the town, avoiding accidents more by good luck than by skill. The road ended on bare hillside, where there was only a footpath.
"Better get out and walk here," said
Bletchley. Haydock suggested,
"Why don't we take the car up? The ground's firm enough."
Mrs. Sproat cried, "Oh, yes, please, please, we must be quick." The car bounced about as it went across the rough ground, but they arrived without any problem on the top of the hill. Here the view was clear.
"No sign of them as far as I can see,"
observed Haydock. He was standing up, looking through some binoculars that he had brought with him. Suddenly, he focused on 2 small moving figures.
"Got 'em!"
He fell back into the driver's seat again, and now the chase was a short one. Bounced up in the air, thrown from side to side as the car drove over the uneven ground, the occupants of the car quickly got closer to those 2 small figures. They could see them clearly now. A woman holding a child by the hand. Still nearer, yes, a child in a green dress. Betty! Suddenly the woman turned and saw the car advancing towards her. With a cry, she picked up the child in her arms and began running towards the edge of the cliff. The car could not follow. The ground was now too uneven and blocked with big stones. It stopped, and Mrs. Sproat was out first, running towards them. The others followed her. When they were within 20 yards of her, the kidnapper turned. She was standing at the very edge of the cliff, and with a cry she held the child closer to herself. Haydock exclaimed, "No! She's going to throw the kid over the cliff!" The woman's face was filled with hate. She spoke, a long angry sentence that none of them understood, and still she held the child and looked from time to time at the sea below. It seemed clear that she was threatening to throw the child over the cliff. All of them stood there, confused and terrified, unable to move for fear of causing a catastrophe. Haydock's hand was in his pocket. He pulled out a pistol and shouted, "Put that child down, or I fire!" The foreign woman laughed. Haydock whispered, "I can't shoot. I might hit the child." Tommy cried, "The woman's crazy. She'll jump over the edge with the child in another moment." Haydock said again helplessly, "It's too dangerous to shoot." But at that moment, a shot rang out. The woman fell back, the child still in her arms. The men ran forward. Mrs. Sproat stood still, the smoking pistol in her hands, her eyes wide open. She took a few steps forward. Tommy was kneeling by the bodies. He turned them over gently. The woman was dead, shot through the head. Unhurt, little Betty Sproat stood up and ran towards her mother, who was standing completely still. Then, at last, Mrs. Sproat moved. She threw away the pistol and fell to her knees, holding the child to her. "She's safe! She's safe! Oh, Betty, Betty!" And then, in a low whisper, she added, Did I kill her? Tuppence said firmly. Don't think about it. Think about Betty. Just think about Betty. Mrs. Sproat held the child close against her, crying uncontrollably. Tuppence went forward to join the men. Haydock said, I couldn't have managed a shot like that. I don't believe the woman has ever used a pistol before. It must have been pure instinct. A miracle, that's what it is. Tuppence murmured, It was a near thing. And she looked down at the sea far below and shivered. Chapter 8. The police identified the dead woman as Wanda Polonska, a Polish refugee, and the inquest on her death opened with the formal identification of the body by a Mrs. Calfont, who worked with refugees. Polonska, she said, had come to England with a cousin and his wife, who were her only relatives. She had experienced great horror in Poland, and her family, including several children, had all been killed. Polonska talked to herself constantly and did not seem normal. The coroner asked why the woman's relatives were not present, and at this point an Inspector Brassey said that the couple had been arrested for a crime at a naval dockyard. The whole family was considered suspicious. They had had a large sum of money in their possession, which they could not explain, but there was no evidence against Polonska, except that her opinions were believed to have been anti-British. It was possible that she had been an enemy agent. The verdict was that Wanda Polonska had been killed by Mrs. Sproat, but that Betty's mother should not be blamed. The following day, Mrs. Blenkinsop and Mr. Meadows met. "Goodbye, Wanda Polonska," said Tommy sadly. Tuppence nodded. Yes, and nothing to tell us who she was working for, and no clues about where the money came from that she and her cousins had. "Do you think Karl von Dynam and Wanda Polonska were working together?" asked Tommy. "Yes," said Tuppence. "Then Karl von Dynam must have arranged the kidnapping. But why kidnap Betty? The Sproats have no money, so it wasn't for ransom, and neither of them are employed by government." "I know, Tommy. It just doesn't make any sense at all. But I've a feeling that Mrs. Sproat could find the reason if only she'd think about it. There must be some piece of information that she discovered without knowing what it was." "Say nothing. Wait for instructions," Tommy quoted from the note found on Mrs. Sproat's bedroom floor. "That means something." "The only thing I can think of is that Mrs. Sproat, or her husband, has been given something to keep by someone else. And they were given it simply because they're such ordinary people that no one would ever suspect they had it. Whatever it may be." "Have you asked Mrs. Sproat to think about why Betty was taken?" "Yes, but all she cares about is having Betty back. That, and having hysterics because she shot someone." "Funny creatures, women," commented Tommy. "I wouldn't have risked firing when she did." "She wouldn't have either if she'd known more about it. It was her complete ignorance of the difficulty of the shot that made her do it. But you know, the first time I saw Wanda Polonska, her face seemed vaguely familiar. I wish I could remember who she reminded me of." At Sans-Souci, Tuppence went straight upstairs to her room, where a tall figure turned away from the window. "Sheila?" said Tuppence. The girl's face was completely white. "They've arrested Karl. What shall I do?" "Oh, my dear." "They've taken him away. I'll never see him again. What shall I do? What shall I do?" And falling on her knees, she started to cry.